So before we talk about the various vaccines for COVID-19, I'd like to talk to you about censorship. So given everything you're saying, why did YouTube and other places censor discussion of ivermectin?
Well, there's a question about why they say they did it, and there's a question about why they actually did it. Now, it is worth mentioning that YouTube is part of a consortium. It is partnered with Twitter, Facebook, Reuters, AP, Financial Times, Washington Post, some other notable organizations, and that this group has appointed itself the arbiter of truth. In effect, they have decided to control discussion ostensibly to prevent the distribution of misinformation. Now, how have they chosen to do that? In this case, they have chosen to simply utilize the recommendations of the WHO and the CDC and apply them as if they are synonymous with scientific truth. Problem, even at their best, the WHO and CDC are not scientific entities. They are entities that are about public health. And public health has this, whether it's right or not, and I believe I disagree with it, but it has this self-assigned right to lie that comes from the fact that there is game theory that works against, for example, a successful vaccination campaign. That if everybody else takes a vaccine and therefore the herd becomes immune through vaccination, and you decide not to take a vaccine, then you benefit from the immunity of the herd without having taken the risk. So people who do best are the people who opt out. That's a hazard. And the WHO and CDC as public health entities effectively oversimplify stories in order that that game theory does not cause a predictable tragedy of the commons. With that said, once that right to lie exists, then it turns out to serve the interests of, for example, pharmaceutical companies, which have emergency use authorizations that require that there not be a safe and effective treatment and have immunity from liability for harms caused by their product. So that's a recipe for disaster, right? You don't need to be a sophisticated thinker about complex systems to see the hazard of immunizing a company from the harm of its own product at the same time that that product can only exist in the market if some other product that works better somehow fails to be noticed. So somehow YouTube is doing the bidding of Merck and others. Whether it knows that that's what it's doing, I have no idea. I think this may be another case of an autopilot that thinks it's doing the right thing because it's parroting the corrupt wisdom of the WHO and the CDC, but the WHO and the CDC have been wrong again and again in this pandemic. And the irony here is that with YouTube coming after me, well, my channel has been right where the WHO and CDC have been wrong consistently over the whole pandemic. So how is it that YouTube is censoring us because the WHO and CDC disagree with us when in fact in past disagreements we've been right and they've been wrong?
There's so much to talk about here. So I've heard this many times actually on the inside of YouTube and with colleagues that I've talked with, is they kind of in a very casual way say their job is simply to slow or prevent the spread of misinformation. And they say it like that's an easy thing to do. Like to know what is true or not is an easy thing to do. And so from the YouTube perspective, I think they basically outsource of the task of knowing what is true or not to public institutions that on a basic Google search claim to be the arbiters of truth. So if you were YouTube, who are exceptionally profitable and exceptionally powerful in terms of controlling what people get to see or not, what would you do? Would you take a stand, a public stand against the WHO, WHO, CDC? Or would you instead say, you know what, let's open the dam and let any video on anything fly, what do you do here? If if Brett Weinstein was put in charge of YouTube for a month in this most critical of times, where YouTube actually has incredible amounts of power to educate the populace, to give power of knowledge to the populace such that they can reform institutions, what would you do? How would you run YouTube?
Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, this is actually quite simple. The founders, the American founders, settled on a counterintuitive formulation that people should be free to say anything. They should be free from the government blocking them from doing so. They did not imagine that in formulating that right, that most of what was said would be of high quality, nor did they imagine it would be free of harmful things. What they correctly reasoned was that the benefit of leaving everything so it can be said exceeds the cost, which everyone understands to be substantial. What I would say is they could not have anticipated the impact, the centrality of platforms like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, etc. If they had, they would not have limited the First Amendment as they did. They clearly understood that the power of the federal government was so great that it needed to be limited by granting explicitly the right of citizens to say anything. In fact, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook may be more powerful in this moment than the federal government of their worst nightmares could have been. The power that these entities have to control thought and to shift civilization is so great that we need to have those same protections. It doesn't mean that harmful things won't be said, but it means that nothing has changed about the cost-benefit analysis of building the right to censor. So if I were running YouTube, the limit of what should be allowed is the limit of the law, right? If what you are doing is legal, then it should not be YouTube's place to limit what gets said or who gets to hear it. That is between speakers and audience. Will harm come from that? Of course it will. But will net harm come from it? No, I don't believe it will. I believe that allowing everything to be said does allow a process in which better ideas do come to the fore and win out.
So you believe that in the end, when there's complete freedom to share ideas, that truth will win out. So what I've noticed, just as a brief side comment, that certain things become viral irregardless of their truth. I've noticed that things that are dramatic and or funny, like things that become memes, don't have to be grounded in truth. And so that what worries me there is that we basically maximize for drama versus maximize for truth in a system where everything is free. And that's worrying in the time of emergency.
Well, yes, it's all worrying in time of emergency, to be sure. But I want you to notice that what you've happened on is actually an analog for a much deeper and older problem. Human beings we are not a blank slate, but we are the blankest slate that nature has ever devised. And there's a reason for that, right? It's where our flexibility comes from. We are robots in which a large fraction of the cognitive capacity of the behavioral capacity has been offloaded to the software layer, which gets written and rewritten over evolutionary time. That means effectively that much of what we are, in fact, the important part of what we are, is housed in the cultural layer and the conscious layer and not in the hardware hard coding layer. That layer is prone to make errors, right? And anybody who's watched a child grow up knows that children make absurd errors all the time, right? That's part of the process, as we were discussing earlier. It is also true that as you look across a field of people discussing things, a lot of what is said is pure nonsense. It's garbage. But the tendency of garbage to emerge and even to spread in the short term does not say that over the long term, what sticks is not the valuable ideas. So there's a high tendency for novelty to be created in the cultural space, but there's also a high tendency for it to go extinct. And you have to keep that in mind. It's not like the genome. right? Everything is happening at a much higher rate. Things are being created, they're being destroyed. And I can't say that, I mean, obviously we've seen totalitarianism arise many times, and it's very destructive each time it does. So it's not like, hey, freedom to come up with any idea you want hasn't produced a whole lot of carnage. But the question is, over time, does it produce more open, fairer, more decent societies? And I believe that it does. I can't prove it, but that does seem to be the pattern.
I believe so as well. The thing is, in the short term, freedom of speech, absolute freedom of speech can be quite destructive. But you nevertheless have to hold on to that, because in the long term, I think you and I guess, are optimistic in the sense that good ideas will win out.
I don't know how strongly I believe that it will work, but I will say I haven't heard a better idea.
Yeah.
I would also point out that there's something very significant in this question of the hubris involved in imagining that you're going to improve the discussion by censoring, which is the majority of concepts at the fringe are nonsense. That's automatic. But the heterodoxy at the fringe, which is indistinguishable at the beginning from the nonsense ideas, is the key to progress. So if you decide, hey, the fringe is 99% garbage, let's just get rid of it, right? Hey, that's a strong win. We're getting rid of 99% garbage for 1% something or other. Mm-hmm. And the point is, yeah, but that 1% something or other is the key. You're throwing out the key. And so that's what YouTube is doing. Frankly, I think at the point that it started censoring my channel, in the immediate aftermath of this major reversal over Lab Leak, it should have looked at itself and said, well, what the hell are we doing? Who are we censoring? We're censoring somebody who was just right, in a conflict with the very same people on whose behalf we are now censoring, right? That should have caused them to wake up.
So you said one approach, if you're on YouTube, is to basically let all videos go that do not violate the law.
Well, I should fix that. Yeah. Okay. I believe that is the basic principle. Yeah. Eric makes an excellent point about the distinction between ideas and personal attacks, doxing, right, these other things. So I agree. There's no value in allowing people to destroy each other's lives, even if there's a technical legal defense for it. Now, how you draw that line, I don't know. But what I'm talking about is, yes, people should be free to traffic in bad ideas, and they should be free to expose that the ideas are bad. And hopefully that process results in better ideas winning out.
Yeah, there's an interesting line between, ideas like the earth is flat, which I believe you should not censor. And then you start to encroach on personal attacks. So not doxing, yes, but not even getting to that. There's a certain point where it's that's no longer ideas. That's somehow not productive, even if it's it feels like believing the earth is flat is somehow productive, because maybe there's a tiny % chance it is. It just feels like personal attacks. It doesn't. I'm torn on this because there's assholes in this world. There's fraudulent people in this world. So sometimes personal attacks are useful to reveal that. But there's a line you can cross. There's a comedy where people make fun of others. I think that's amazing. That's very powerful. And that's very useful, even if it's painful. But then there's when it gets to be, there's a certain line. It's a gray area where you cross, where it's no longer in any possible world productive. And that's a really weird gray area for YouTube to operate in. And it feels like it should be a crowdsourced thing where people vote on it. But then again, do you trust the majority to vote on what is crossing the line and not? I mean, this is really interesting on this particular, the scientific aspect of this. Do you think YouTube should take more of a stance, not censoring, but to actually have scientists within YouTube having these kinds of discussions, and then be able to almost speak out in a transparent way? This is what we're going to let this video stand, but here's all these other opinions. Almost take a more active role in its recommendation system in trying to present a full picture to you. Right now, they're not. The recommender systems are not human fine-tuned. They're all based on how you click, and there's this clustering algorithms. They're not taking an active role on giving you the full spectrum of ideas in the space of science. They just censor or not.
Well, at the moment, it's going to be pretty hard to compel me that these people should be trusted with any sort of curation or comment on matters of evidence, because they have demonstrated that they are incapable of doing it well. You could make such an argument, and I guess I'm open to the idea of institutions that would look something like YouTube, that would be capable of offering something valuable. I mean, and even just the fact of them literally curating things and putting some videos next to others, implies something. Yeah. So there's a question to be answered, but at the moment, no. Yeah. At the moment, what it is doing is quite literally putting not only individual humans in tremendous jeopardy by censoring discussion of useful tools and making tools that are more hazardous than has been acknowledged seem safe, right? But it is also placing humanity in danger of a permanent relationship with this pathogen. I cannot emphasize enough how expensive that is. It's effectively incalculable. If the relationship becomes permanent, the number of people who will ultimately suffer and die from it is indefinitely large.
Yeah, there's currently the algorithm is very rabbit hole driven, meaning if you click on the flat Earth videos, that's all you're going to be presented with, and you're not going to be nicely presented with arguments against the flat Earth. And the flip side of that, if you watch like quantum mechanics videos, or no, general relativity videos, it's very rare you're going to get a recommendation. Have you considered the Earth is flat? Mm-hmm. And I think you should have both. Mm-hmm. Same with vaccine. Videos that present the power and the incredible like biology, genetics, virology about the vaccine, you're rarely going to get videos from well-respected scientific minds presenting possible dangers of the vaccine. And the vice versa is true as well, which is if you're looking at the dangers of the vaccine on YouTube, you're not going to get the highest quality of videos recommended to you. And I'm not talking about like manually inserted CDC videos that are like the most untrustworthy things you can possibly watch about how everybody should take the vaccine. It's the safest thing ever. No, it's about incredible, again, MIT colleagues of mine, incredible biologists, virologists that talk about the details of how the mRNA vaccines work and all those kinds of things. I think maybe this is me with the AI hat on, is I think the algorithm can fix a lot of this. And YouTube should build better algorithms and trust that and coupled with complete freedom of speech to expand what people are able to think about, present always varied views, not balanced in some artificial way, hard-coded way, but balanced in a way that's crowdsourced. I think that's an algorithm problem that could be solved, because then you can delegate it to the algorithm as opposed to this hard code censorship of basically creating artificial boundaries on what can and can't be discussed. Instead, creating a full spectrum of exploration that can be done and trusting the intelligence of people to do the exploration.
Well, there's a lot there. I would say we have to keep in mind that we're talking about a publicly held company with shareholders and obligations to them, and that may make it impossible. And I remember many years ago, back in the early days of Google, I remember a sense of terror at the loss of general search. Right? It used to be that Google, if you searched, came up with the same thing for everyone. And then it got personalized. And for a while, it was possible to turn off the personalization, which was still not great, because if everybody else is looking at a personalized search and you can tune into one that isn't personalized, that doesn't tell you why the world is sounding the way it is. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, it was at least an option. And then that vanished. And the problem is, I think this is literally deranging us. Mm-hmm. That in effect, I mean, what you're describing is unthinkable. It is unthinkable that in the face of a campaign to vaccinate people in order to reach herd immunity, that YouTube would give you videos on hazards of vaccines when this is, how hazardous the vaccines are is an unsettled question.
Why is it unthinkable? That doesn't make any sense. From a company perspective, if intelligent people in large amounts are open-minded and are thinking through the hazards and the benefits of a vaccine, a company should find the best videos to present what people are thinking about.
Well, let's come up with a hypothetical. Okay, let's come up with a very deadly disease for which there's a vaccine that is very safe, though not perfectly safe. And we are then faced with YouTube trying to figure out what to do for somebody searching on vaccine safety. Suppose it is necessary, in order to drive the pathogen to extinction, something like smallpox, that people get on board with the vaccine. But there's a tiny fringe of people who thinks that the vaccine is a mind control agent, right? So should YouTube direct people to the only claims against this vaccine, which is that it's a mind control agent, when in fact the vaccine is very safe, whatever that means? If that were the actual configuration of the puzzle, then YouTube would be doing active harm, pointing you to this other video potentially. Now, yes, I would love to live in a world where people are up to the challenge of sorting that out. But my basic point would be, if it's an evidentiary question and there is essentially no evidence that the vaccine is a mind control agent, and there's plenty of evidence that the vaccine is safe, then, well, you look for this video, we're going to give you this one, puts it on a par, right? So for the mind that's tracking how much thought is there behind it's safe versus how much thought is there behind it's a mind control agent, will result in artificially elevating this. Now, in the current case, what we've seen is not this at all. We have seen evidence obscured in order to create a false story about safety. And we saw the inverse with ivermectin. We saw a campaign to portray the drug as more dangerous and less effective than the evidence clearly suggested it was. So we're not talking about a comparable thing. But I guess my point is the algorithmic solution that you point to creates a problem of its own, which is that it means that the way to get exposure is to generate something fringy. If you're the only thing on some fringe, then suddenly YouTube would be recommending those things, and that's obviously a gameable system at best.
Yeah, but the solution to that, I know you're creating a thought experiment, maybe playing a little bit of a devil's advocate. I think the solution to that is not to limit the algorithm in the case of the super deadly virus. It's for the scientists to step up and become better communicators, more charismatic, is fight the battle of ideas. So to create better videos, like if the virus is truly deadly, you have a lot more ammunition, a lot more data, a lot more material to work with in terms of communicating with the public. So be better at communicating and stop being, you have to start trusting the intelligence of people, and also being transparent and playing the game of the internet, which is like, what is the internet hungry for? I believe authenticity. Stop looking like you're full of shit. It's the scientific community. If there's any flaw that I currently see, especially the people that are in public office, that like Anthony Fauci, they look like they're full of shit. And I know they're brilliant. Why don't they look more authentic? So they're losing that game. And I think a lot of people observing this entire system now, younger scientists, are seeing this and saying, okay, if I want to continue being a scientist in the public eye and I want to be effective at my job, I'm going to have to be a lot more authentic. So they're learning the lesson. This evolutionary system is working. There's just a younger generation of minds coming up that I think will do a much better job in this battle of ideas, that when the much more dangerous virus comes along, they'll be able to be better communicators. At least that's the hope. The using the algorithm to control that is, I feel like is a big problem. So you're going to have the same problem with a deadly virus as with the current virus if you let YouTube draw hard lines by the PR and the marketing people versus the broad community of scientists.
Well, in some sense, you're suggesting something that's close kin to what I was saying about, freedom of expression ultimately provides an advantage to better ideas. So I'm in agreement, broadly speaking. But I would also say there's probably some sort of, let's imagine the world that you propose where YouTube shows you the alternative point of view. That has the problem that I suggest. But one thing you could do is you could give us the tools to understand what we're looking at, right? You could give us, so first of all, there's something I think myopic, solipsistic, narcissistic about an algorithm that serves shareholders by showing you what you want to see rather than what you need to know, right? Yeah. That's the distinction, is flattering you, playing to your blind spot is something that algorithm will figure out. But it's not healthy for us all to have Google playing to our blind spot. It's very, very dangerous. So what I really want is analytics that allow me, or maybe options and analytics. The options should allow me to see what alternative perspectives are being explored, right? So here's the thing I'm searching, and it leads me down this road, right? Let's say it's ivermectin, okay? I find all of this evidence that ivermectin works. I find all of these discussions and people talk about various protocols and this and that. And then I could say, all right, what is the other side? And I could see who is searching, not as individuals, but what demographics are searching alternatives. And maybe you could even combine it with something Reddit-like, where effectively, let's say that there was a position that, I don't know, that a vaccine is a mind control device, and you could have a steelman this argument competition effectively, and the better answers that steelman it as well as possible would rise to the top. And so you could read the top 3 or 4 explanations about why this really credibly is a mind control product, and you could say, well, that doesn't really add up. I can check these 3 things myself, and they can't possibly be right, and you could dismiss it. And then as an argument that was credible, let's say plate tectonics, before that was an accepted concept, you'd say, wait a minute, there is evidence for plate tectonics. As crazy as it sounds that the continents are floating around on liquid, actually, that's not so implausible. We've got these subduction zones. We've got geology that is compatible. We've got puzzle piece continents that seem to fit together. Wow, that's a surprising amount of evidence for that position. So I'm going to file some Bayesian probability with it that's updated for the fact that actually the steelman argument's better than I was expecting, right? So I could imagine something like that where, I would love the search to be indifferent to who's searching, right? The solipsistic thing is too dangerous. So the search could be general, so we would all get a sense for what everybody else was seeing too. And then some layer that didn't have anything to do with what YouTube points you to or not, but allowed you to see, the general pattern of adherence to searching for information, and again, a layer in which those things could be defended, so you could hear what a good argument sounded like rather than just hear a caricatured argument.
Yeah, and also reward people, creators that have demonstrated like a track record of open-mindedness and correctness as much as it can be measured over a long term, and sort of, a lot of this maps to incentivizing good long-term behavior, not immediate kind of dopamine rush signals. I think ultimately the algorithm on the individual level should optimize for personal growth, long-term happiness, just growth intellectually, growth in terms of lifestyle, personally, and so on, as opposed to immediate. I think that's going to build a better society. Not even just like truth, because I think truth is a complicated thing. It's more just you growing as a person, exploring the space of ideas, changing your mind often, increasing the level to which you're open-minded, the knowledge base you're operating from, the willingness to empathize with others, all those kinds of things the algorithm should optimize for. Like creating a better human at the individual level, I think that's a great business model, because the person that's using this tool will then be happier with themselves for having used it, and it will be a lifelong quote unquote customer. I think it's a great business model to make a happy, open-minded, knowledgeable, better human being.
It's a terrible business model under the current system. What you want is to build the system in which it is a great business model.
Why is it a terrible model?
Because it will be decimated by those who play to the short term.
I don't think so. Why? Well,
I mean, I think we're living it. We're living it.
Well, no, because if you have the alternative that presents itself, it points out the emperor has no clothes. I mean, it
Right.
points out that YouTube is operating in this way, Twitter is operating in this way,
So-
Facebook is operating in this way.
How long term would you like the wisdom to prove out?
Well, even a week is better than what's currently happening.
Right. But the problem is, if a week loses out to an hour, right? And
I don't think it loses out. It loses out in the short term.
that's my point.
But if
Is
you're a great communicator and you basically say, look, here's the metrics. And a lot of it is like how people actually feel. Like this is what people experience with social media. They look back at the previous month and say, I felt shitty on a lot of days because of social media.
right.
Like if you look back at the previous few weeks and say, wow, I'm a better person because of that month happened. They immediately choose the product that's going to lead to that. That's what love for products looks like. If you love, like a lot of people love their Tesla car, like or iPhone or like beautiful design. That's what love looks like. You look back, I'm a better person for having used this thing.
Well, you got to ask yourself the question, though. If this is such a great business model, why isn't it evolving? Why don't we see it?
Honestly, it's competence. It's like people are just, it's not easy to build it's not easy to build products, tools, systems on new ideas. It's kind of a new idea. We've gone through this, everything we're seeing now comes from the ideas of the initial birth of the internet. There just needs to be new sets of tools that are incentivizing long-term personal growth and happiness. That's it.
Right. But what we have is a market that doesn't favor this, right? I mean, for one thing, we had an alternative to Facebook, right? That looked, you owned your own data. It wasn't exploitative. And Facebook bought a huge interest in it and it died. I mean, who do you know who's on Diaspora?
The execution there was not good.
Right.
And
But it could have gotten better, right?
I don't think that the argument that why hasn't somebody done it, a good argument for it's not going to completely destroy all of Twitter and Facebook when somebody does it, or Twitter will catch up and pivot to the algorithm.
This is not what I'm saying. There's obviously great ideas that remain unexplored because nobody has gotten to the foothill that would allow you to explore them. That's true. But, an internet that was non-predatory is an obvious idea. And many of us know that we want it. And many of us have seen prototypes of it, and we don't move because there's no audience there. So the network effects cause you to stay with the predatory internet. But let me just, I wasn't kidding about build the system in which your idea is a great business plan. Mm-hmm. So in our upcoming book, Heather and I in our last chapter explore something called the Fourth Frontier. And Fourth Frontier has to do with sort of a 2.0 version of civilization, which we freely admit we can't tell you very much about. It's something that we would have to prototype our way there. We would have to effectively navigate our way there. But the result would be very much like what you're describing. It would be something that effectively liberates humans meaningfully. And most importantly, it has to feel like growth without depending on growth. In other words, human beings are creatures that, like every other creature, is effectively looking for growth, right? We are looking for underexploited or unexploited opportunities. And when we find them, our ancestors, for example, if they happened into a new valley that was unexplored by people, their population would grow until it hit carrying capacity. So there would be this great feeling of there's abundance until you hit carrying capacity, which is inevitable, and then zero-sum dynamics would set in. So in order for human beings to flourish long-term, the way to get there is to satisfy the desire for growth without hooking it to actual growth, which only moves in fits and starts. And this is actually, I believe, the key to avoiding these, spasms of human tragedy when, in the absence of growth, people do something that causes their population to experience growth, which is they go and make war on or commit genocide against some other population, which is something we obviously have to stop.
By the way, this is a hunter-gatherer's guide to the 21st century, co-authored.
That's right.
With your wife, Heather, being released in September. I believe you said you're going to do a little bit of a preview videos on each chapter leading up to the release. So I'm looking forward to the last chapter, as well as all the previous ones. I have a few questions on that. So you have you generally have faith to clarify that technology could be the thing that empowers this kind of future.
Well, if you just let technology evolve, it's going to be our undoing, right? One of the things that I fault my libertarian friends for is this faith that the market is going to find solutions without destroying us. And my sense is I'm a very strong believer in markets, right? I believe in their power even above some market fundamentalists. But what I don't believe is that they should be allowed to plot our course, right? Markets are very good at figuring out how to do things. They are not good at all about figuring out what we should do, right? What we should want. We have to tell markets what we want, and then they can tell us how to do it best. And if we adopted that kind of pro-market, but in a context where it's not steering, where human well-being is actually the driver, we can do remarkable things, and the technology that emerges would naturally be enhancing of human well-being. Perfectly so? No, but overwhelmingly so. But at the moment, markets are finding our every defect of character and exploiting them and making huge profits and making us worse to each other in the process.